The Montana Territory, 1885, a time when the West was still wild and untamed, much like the hearts of those who sought to claim it. For some men, finding a wife meant placing an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper, hoping for a woman gentle and delicate enough to bring civilization to their rough existence. But what happens when the bride who arrives is anything but the docile helpmate they expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Eleanor Reed, a woman whose fiery spirit and unwavering determination led 3 potential husbands to send her back east before she even unpacked her trunk. A woman labeled too fierce for frontier life until she met Jackson Miller, a rancher whose battle scars ran deeper than the ones visible on his weathered face. In the harshest winter the territory had seen in decades, these 2 outcasts would discover that sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the most unforgiving conditions, and that true courage wears many faces, even that of a mail-order bride. Eleanor Reed stood on the train platform in Silver Creek, Montana Territory, her breath-forming clouds in the crisp autumn air. The small frontier town looked exactly as she had expected, dusty, sparse, and utterly unlike the bustling streets of Philadelphia she had left behind. But unlike the other women who disembarked with trepidation in their steps, Eleanor's posture remained ramrod straight, her chin lifted in quiet defiance against the unknown. At 26, Eleanor was considered firmly on the shelf back east, too outspoken, too educated, too unwilling to simper and pretend fascination with men's opinions when she had plenty of her own. After her father's death left her penniless, becoming a mail order bride had seemed the most practical solution, even if it meant leaving behind everything familiar. Miss Reed. A man approached, hat in hand. He was shorter than she had imagined, with a nervous twitch to his mustache. This was Henry Dawson, the mercantile owner who had written such promising letters about building a life together in this new territory. Mr. Dawson, Eleanor extended her gloved hand, which he took with visible surprise. I trust the journey from Billings wasn't too troublesome for you. No, not at all. His eyes darted over her tall frame and the practical cut of her traveling dress. No frills or excessive decoration adorned her attire. Eleanor believed in function over frivolity. You're taller than I expected. Eleanor had heard this comment often enough that she no longer felt the need to apologize for her height. Yes, it runs in my family. Henry cleared his throat. Well, I've arranged a room for you at the boarding house. We can be married by Pastor Wilson tomorrow if that suits. I'd prefer to have a few days to settle, Mr. Dawson. Getting to know one another before we enter into marriage seems sensible, don't you think? Her direct gaze caused him to blink rapidly. Of course. Very sensible. Their walk to the boarding house was filled with Henry's nervous chatter about the town, the coming winter, and the merchandise expected on next month's supply train. Eleanor asked pointed questions about the store's accounting practices and inventory management, topics that seemed to fluster Henry rather than impress him with her business acumen. You seem to have quite the head for figures, Miss Reed, he finally commented as they reached the boarding house steps. My father was an accountant. He believed daughters should be educated as thoroughly as sons would be. She smiled, remembering her father's patience as he taught her mathematics long after her mother had given up trying to interest her in needlepoint. How progressive of him. Henry's tone suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment. Well, Mrs. Parker runs a respectable establishment here. I'll call on you tomorrow, shall I? The boarding house was clean, if sparse, and Mrs. Parker seemed kind enough, if somewhat surprised by Eleanor's trunk full of books alongside her modest wardrobe. Eleanor spent that evening unpacking and observing the town from her window. Silver Creek was smaller than she had anticipated, but she could see potential in its dusty streets and wooden buildings. A new life awaited, and Eleanor Reed had never been one to shy away from a challenge. Henry Dawson called upon her the next day as promised, taking her on a tour of his mercantile. Eleanor immediately noted several inefficiencies in his shelving system and the disorganized ledger he kept. If you grouped similar items together and implemented a proper inventory tracking system, you could reduce waste and improve customer satisfaction, she suggested, already envisioning how she might transform the cluttered shop into a model of efficiency. Henry's smile grew strained. "I've managed just fine these 5 years, Miss Reed. Most ladies find the domestic goods section more interesting." He attempted to guide her toward the fabric bolts and sewing notions. Eleanor followed, though her mind was still calculating potential improvements. "The fabric selection is limited. Have you considered stocking more practical materials for work clothes? The calico is lovely, but surely the miners and ranchers need sturdy canvas and wool." That evening, Eleanor dined alone at the boarding house, aware of whispers and glances from the other residents. Mrs. Parker, a widow of indeterminate age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, eventually sat across from her. "Mr. Dawson seemed a bit flustered when he dropped you off earlier," she remarked, pouring them both tea. Eleanor sighed. "I may have overwhelmed him with suggestions for his business." Mrs. Parker's lips twitched. "Henry Dawson has been running that store the same way since he took it over from his uncle. Men like that don't appreciate innovation, especially from a woman," Eleanor finished. "Yes, I'm familiar with the sentiment. This territory needs strong women, Miss Reed. Don't let anyone tell you differently. But it might be wise to ease a man like Henry into your forthright nature." Eleanor considered this advice as she sipped her tea. She had never been particularly skilled at tempering her opinions or playing the demure maiden. Perhaps she should try harder with Henry. After all, her options were limited. The next 3 days passed in a similar fashion. Eleanor attempted to show interest in the aspects of mercantilist life that Henry deemed appropriate for a wife, arranging displays, welcoming customers with a smile, pouring coffee for the men who gathered to exchange news, but inevitably, her natural inclinations would emerge. She reorganized an entire shelf while Henry was occupied with a customer. She corrected his arithmetic when he miscalculated a sale. She debated territorial politics with a group of miners, displaying far more knowledge than Henry himself possessed. On the 4th day, Eleanor arrived at the mercantile to find Henry unusually solemn. "Miss Reed," he began, ushering her into the small office behind the counter. "I've given our arrangement considerable thought." Eleanor already knew what would follow. She had seen the discomfort in his eyes grow with each passing day. "I believe we may not be as compatible as our correspondence suggested," he continued. "You are an impressive woman, certainly, but I fear you would not be content with the life I can offer." "You mean I am not the biddable wife you envisioned?" Eleanor replied, no bitterness in her tone, merely a statement of fact. Henry at least had the grace to look embarrassed. "You deserve someone who can appreciate your unique qualities. I've taken the liberty of introducing your situation to Thomas Whitaker. He owns the lumber mill outside of town and has been seeking a wife. Perhaps you would be better matched." And so, for the price of a new train ticket and a sincere apology, Henry Dawson dissolved their agreement. Eleanor found herself redirected to Thomas Whitaker's substantial home at the edge of town, where the widow who kept house for him eyed her with suspicion. Thomas Whitaker proved to be everything Henry Dawson was not: tall, confident and commanding. His lumber mill was the largest employer in the region, and he ran it with ruthless efficiency. Initially, Eleanor found his decisive nature refreshing after Henry's waffling. "I need a wife who understands business," he told her bluntly during their first dinner together. someone who can handle the social obligations that come with my position while I focus on expansion. Your background seems well suited. Eleanor allowed herself a flicker of hope. I would welcome involvement in business matters. My father always said I had a natural aptitude. Thomas's expression cooled slightly. Involvement? No, Miss Reed. I meant understanding why my business must come first. A wife's duty is to create a peaceful home and represent the family well in society. I have foremen and managers for business concerns. The following days revealed the vast gulf between Thomas's expectations and Eleanor's nature. He appreciated her intellect in theory, but became irritated when she questioned his methods after observing operations at the mill. When she suggested improvements to the cutting line that could reduce waste, his expression darkened. My men won't take instruction from a woman, Miss Reed. It undermines my authority. But if the suggestion has merit, merit is irrelevant. Perception is everything. In business. The final break came when Eleanor, genuinely trying to be helpful, reorganized Thomas's office during his absence, implementing a filing system that would allow him to locate contracts and correspondence more efficiently. Thomas returned to find his papers in unfamiliar places, and Eleanor proudly explaining her system. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His face flushed with anger. This is exactly what I feared. You overstep your bounds at every turn. A wife should compliment her husband, not compete with him. 2 weeks after arriving in Silver Creek, Eleanor found herself once again at the boarding house, this time with an invitation to meet Samuel Cooper, the town banker. Mrs. Parker's expression was sympathetic as she welcomed Eleanor back. Mr. Whitaker found me too assertive, Eleanor explained, unpacking her trunk for the second time. Assertive is one way to put it, Mrs. Parker replied with a small smile, though he used considerably less flattering terms at the barber shop yesterday. Samuel Cooper was a widower of 45 with thinning hair and meticulous habits, where Henry had been intimidated and Thomas angered by Eleanor's forthright nature. Samuel seemed merely amused. You've caused quite the stir in our little community, Miss Reed, he remarked over tea in his well-appointed parlor. 2 potential husbands. In less than a month, that might be a record for Silver Creek. Eleanor appreciated his humor, but remained cautious. I find that being honest about who I am from the beginning avoids disappointment later, Mr. Cooper. A commendable philosophy. I value honesty myself. My late wife, God rest her soul, was a gentle, nurturing woman. After 5 years alone, I find I miss female companionship, but I have no illusions about finding another like Martha. This pragmatic approach appealed to Eleanor. Perhaps a man who had already experienced a loving marriage would be more accepting of a different kind of partnership. Samuel was undeniably intelligent and cultured by frontier standards. His home contained more books than Eleanor had seen since leaving Philadelphia, and he engaged her in stimulating conversation about literature and current events. He seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and didn't flinch when she disagreed with him. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Eleanor allowed herself to believe she might have found a suitable match. Samuel didn't need her to pretend, to be something she wasn't. His established position meant he had nothing to prove, unlike Henry with his struggling business or Thomas with his empire-building ambitions. Their courtship proceeded smoothly for nearly 2 weeks. Samuel introduced Eleanor to the respectable families of Silver Creek, proudly showcasing her knowledge and wit. Eleanor began to envision a life as Mrs. Cooper, managing his household, reading by the fire on winter evenings, perhaps even assisting with some of the bank's correspondence. Then came the dinner party at Judge Wilson's home, where the conversation turned to the territorial governor's recent policies regarding land claims and water rights. Eleanor, who had thoroughly studied these issues before leaving Philadelphia, offered her analysis of how the new regulations might affect small ranchers. The table fell silent. Samuel's smile remained fixed, but something in his eyes hardened. Later, as they walked back to the boarding house, his manner was noticeably cooler. "You made quite an impression tonight," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The water rights issue is fascinating from a legal perspective," Eleanor replied. "Judge Wilson seemed interested in my observations." "Yes, well," Samuel cleared his throat. "In the future, perhaps it would be best to let the men handle political discussions. A woman with too many opinions on such matters can make people uncomfortable." Eleanor stopped walking. "Are you uncomfortable with my opinions, Mr. Cooper?" Samuel sighed. "I admire your intelligence, Miss Reed, truly, but there's a difference between private intellectual discourse and public display. A banker's wife must be above reproach in all things, including knowing when to speak and when to smile politely, even when the smile conceals valuable insight." The familiar disappointment settled in Eleanor's chest. Another man who wanted. Her mind dimmed to make his shine brighter. "Especially then," Samuel replied, not unkindly. "The world has certain expectations, Miss Reed. Fighting them at every turn only leads to unhappiness." 3 days later, Samuel Cooper regretfully informed Eleanor that he didn't believe their temperaments were well suited for marriage after all. Unlike her previous rejections, he offered no alternative suitor, merely a month's lodging at the boarding house paid in advance to give her time to consider her options. The news spread quickly through Silver Creek. 3 men had found Eleanor Reed too fierce, too opinionated, too much altogether for frontier life. Mrs. Parker found her sitting alone on the boarding house porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "I've received a letter," Mrs. Parker said without preamble, settling into the chair beside Eleanor, "from Jackson Miller. He owns the Double M Ranch about 20 miles north of here. His foreman was in town last week and heard about your situation." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Is Mr. Miller looking for entertainment? The tale of the unwanted mail-order bride must provide quite the amusement." "Jackson Miller isn't a man, and who finds amusement in much these days," Mrs. Parker replied soberly. "He lost his wife and son in a fire 5 years ago, nearly died trying to save them. Half his face and arm bear the scars of it." "How tragic," Eleanor murmured, her irritation fading. "He's a good man, hard, yes, and more comfortable with his horses than people since the tragedy, but fair. He needs a wife, not for company or society, but because his sister, who's been keeping house for him, is returning east to care for their ailing mother." Eleanor felt a flicker of indignation. "And he thinks I'm desperate enough to accept any offer. After 3 rejections." Mrs. Parker's steady gaze held no judgment. "He thinks a woman who speaks her mind might prefer straight talk to pretty words. He offers a marriage of convenience, room and board in exchange for running his household. No false expectations on either side." "That's unusually honest. That's Jackson Miller. He has no patience for pretense anymore." Mrs. Parker handed her the letter. "Read it yourself. He'll send a wagon at the end of the week if you're interested. If not, no hard feelings." Later that night, Eleanor read the brief, blunt letter by lamplight. The handwriting was strong but uneven, as if written by someone unused to correspondence or perhaps hampered by injury. There were no flowery promises or romantic overtures, just straightforward terms and a simple statement. "I don't care about your past or what the town thinks. I need someone who can handle themselves and isn't afraid of hard work or hard truths." As the first snowflakes of an early winter began to fall outside her window, Eleanor Reed considered her dwindling options. Return east in defeat? Seek employment. In a town where her reputation was already established as difficult and unmanageable, or accept this final offer from a scarred, solitary rancher who, at the very least, seemed to value the very qualities others found so objectionable. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, blanketing Silver Creek in white silence. By morning, the world would be transformed. Perhaps, Eleanor thought as she folded the letter, it was time she transformed as well, not by becoming less, as the others had wanted, but by finding a place where her strength might finally be an asset rather than a liability. With the first light of dawn, Eleanor Reed made her decision. She would meet Jackson Miller and see for herself if a battle-scarred rancher and a too-fierce bride might forge something honest from the ruins of their expectations. The wagon that arrived for Eleanor at week's end was sturdy but weathered, much like the man who drove it. Walter Jenkins, the foreman of the Double M Ranch, was a leathery man in his 50s with sun-creased eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Miss Reed?" He tipped his hat but didn't dismount. "Got room for one trunk, and whatever else you can fit in that space there." He gestured to a small area behind the seat. "Weather's turning. Best we get moving before it worsens." The sky hung heavy with the promise of more snow, confirming his assessment. Eleanor had packed her belongings with efficiency, prioritizing her books and practical clothing over the few frivolous items she'd brought from Philadelphia. Mrs. Parker pressed a small package into her hands as they said their goodbyes. "Seed packets," she explained. "For starting a kitchen garden come spring. A woman should have something of her own growing, especially out there." The journey to the Double M stretched from hours into a day as the snow began falling in earnest, forcing them to travel at a cautious pace. Walter was a man of few words, answering Eleanor's questions with brief, factual responses that offered little insight into what awaited her. "What kind of man is Mr. Miller?" she finally asked directly as they crested a hill that revealed a vast, snow-dusted valley below. Walter considered this for a long moment. "Fair. Expects hard work because he works harder than anyone. Don't suffer. Fools." He glanced at her. "I haven't talked much since the fire. Mrs. Parker mentioned he was injured saving his family. Tried to, couldn't." The simple statement conveyed volumes of tragedy, changed him, not just the scars. As the wagon descended into the valley, Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the Double M, a sprawling ranch with a sturdy main house, several outbuildings and corrals where horses moved like dark shadows against the snow. It was larger than she'd anticipated, suggesting Jackson Miller's operation was substantial despite its isolation. "He runs the finest quarter horses in the territory," Walter volunteered, following her gaze. "Started with just 4 mares and a stallion after the war. Built it all himself." The main house was constructed of solid timber, 2 stories, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. As Walter brought the wagon to a halt, the front door opened, spilling golden lamplight into the gathering dusk. The woman who emerged was tall and angular, with streaks of silver in her dark hair, despite being only in her early 40s. Her resemblance to the man who followed her made their relationship immediately apparent. "You must be Miss Reed. I'm Caroline Miller," she said, helping Eleanor down from the wagon. "This is my brother, Jackson." Eleanor had prepared herself for the scars Mrs. Parker had described, but the reality still required a moment's adjustment. The left side of Jackson Miller's face bore the angry red marks of severe burns, pulling his mouth into a slight grimace. His left hand, emerging from beneath a rolled shirt sleeve, showed similar damage, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, sharp, assessing the color of storm clouds over the mountains. "Miss Reed." His voice was a rough baritone, as if damaged by smoke or disuse. "Welcome to the Double M." He made no move to take her. A hand, instead gesturing toward the house. "Caroline's made supper. You must be hungry after the journey." Inside, the house was plain but well maintained, with sturdy furniture and practical touches that spoke of Caroline's careful management. The kitchen was warm and fragrant, with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread. "Walter says the pass might close if this snow keeps up," Caroline said, as they settled at the table. "We could be isolated for weeks." "All the more reason to finalize arrangements quickly," Jackson replied, serving himself stew with his right hand, the left remaining below the table's edge. "Miss Reed needs to know what she's agreeing to before she's trapped here." Eleanor appreciated his directness. "I've read your letter, Mr. Miller. You've been admirably clear about your expectations. Reading and seeing are different matters." His gaze met hers directly. "This isn't a place for someone who needs society or soft living. Winters are harsh. Spring brings mud deep enough to swallow a man. Summer's short and demanding. Fall is preparation for doing it all again. I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, Mr. Miller." Something flickered in his expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. "Why did the others send you back?" The blunt question might have offended Eleanor weeks ago. Now she found his forthrightness refreshing. "I spoke my mind too readily, made suggestions about their businesses, discussed politics at a dinner party, failed to conform to their expectations of a proper wife." Jackson nodded, as if this confirmed something. "And what are your expectations, Miss Reed? Every bargain has two sides," Eleanor considered carefully. "Respect, not flattery or false courtesy, but basic respect for my intelligence and capability. I don't require affection, but I won't be treated as property or an ornament. Fair terms." Jackson set down his spoon. "Here's what I offer. A marriage in name, with separate sleeping quarters. You'll manage the household, which includes cooking, cleaning, mending, and keeping accounts. During busy seasons, everyone works where needed. Garden, barn, even with the horses if you've the skill for it. You'll have a monthly allowance for personal needs, use of the library such as it is, and my name for whatever protection that provides." Caroline watched this exchange with an unreadable expression. "Jackson," she interjected gently, "perhaps Miss Reed would like time to rest before making decisions." "There's a storm coming, and you're leaving in 3 days," he replied, not unkindly. "Time is a luxury we don't have." That night, in the neat guest room Caroline had prepared, Eleanor sat by the window watching snow accumulate in the ranch yard. The honesty of Jackson Miller's proposal resonated with her practical nature. No false promises or romantic illusions, just straightforward terms for a partnership of convenience. After the disappointments in Silver Creek, such clarity was almost a relief, yet questions lingered. What kind of life would she build in this remote place with a man so marked by tragedy? Could two people wounded in different ways, she by society's constraints, he by devastating loss, forge something worthwhile from necessity? Morning brought heavier snowfall, and the realization that decisions couldn't be postponed. Over breakfast, Eleanor announced her acceptance of Jackson's terms. If he felt either satisfaction or misgiving, his scarred features revealed nothing. "Pastor Williams can't reach us in this weather," he said. "We'll need to formalize things once the road's clear. In the meantime, Caroline will show you the household operations." The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity as Caroline transferred her knowledge of running the Double M household. Eleanor discovered the ranch was nearly self-sufficient by necessity. They smoked their own meat, made soap from rendered fat and lye, preserved fruits and vegetables from a substantial garden, and maintained an efficient system for everything from laundry to bookkeeping. Jackson modernized where he could, Caroline explained, showing Eleanor the pump that brought water directly into the kitchen sink. He's practical above all else. Eleanor rarely saw Jackson during daylight hours. Despite the snow, ranch operations continued. Horses needed tending, repairs couldn't wait for fair weather, and the small crew of hands who lived in the bunkhouse required management. He returned each evening covered in snow, ate quickly, and retreated to his study, where Eleanor sometimes heard him moving about late into the night. On Caroline's final evening, as the women sat mending by the fire, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been forming since her arrival. "He seems to live only for work. Is there nothing else that brings him joy?" Caroline's hands still. Before the fire, Jackson was different, laughed easily, sang to his son at bedtime. Elizabeth, his wife, could calm him with just a word when his temper flared. She resumed her stitching. Now the horses come closest, especially that black stallion, Tempest. Saving that animal from a mountain lion attack was the first time I saw a spark of the old Jackson after the tragedy. How did he come to think of taking another wife after such a loss? He didn't. It was my idea. Caroline tied off her thread. Mother's health is failing, and Jackson refused to leave the ranch to accompany me east. I told him he needed someone to manage things here. Someone competent and strong-willed enough to handle this place and him. A small smile touched her lips. When Walter came back from town with stories of a mail-order bride too fierce for Silver Creek's menfolk, I knew we'd found the right candidate. The morning of Caroline's departure dawned clear and cold. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine white landscape under a brilliant blue sky. Walter had the wagon ready early, packed with Caroline's trunks and provisions for the journey to the train station in Billings. "The passes should be clear enough," Jackson said, helping his sister into the wagon. His expression, usually so guarded, softened as he looked at her. "Right when you arrive." "Take care of each other," Caroline replied, her gaze moving meaningfully between Jackson and Eleanor. "And remember what I said about patience." As the wagon disappeared down the long drive, Eleanor felt the weight of responsibility settle fully on her shoulders. She was now effectively mistress of the Double M, married, or not, with a household to run and a wounded man's trust to justify. "I've worked in the North Pasture," Jackson said, already turning toward the barn. "Supper at 6. Left alone, Eleanor spent the day familiarizing herself with the house, the pantry with its carefully preserved stores, the linen closet stacked with Caroline's meticulous handiwork, the small library containing an eclectic collection of books that revealed more about Jackson Miller than he perhaps realized. Practical volumes on horse breeding and ranch management sat alongside poetry collections and well-worn copies of Shakespeare and Dickens. By late afternoon, Eleanor had prepared a hearty stew and bread for the evening meal. As she worked, she contemplated the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a respectable spinster in Philadelphia, facing genteel poverty. Now she stood in a remote Montana ranch house, preparing to become the wife of a man she barely knew, a man who carried visible reminders of heartbreaking loss on his very skin. Jackson returned as the light was fading, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. He hesitated almost imperceptibly at the threshold, as if struck by the sight of a woman who wasn't his sister moving about the kitchen. "Something smells good," he offered, hanging his coat by the door. "Beef stew with root vegetables," Eleanor replied. "There's hot water for washing up." They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness Eleanor had anticipated failing to materialize. Jackson ate with appreciation rather than the distracted haste she'd observed on previous evenings. "You found the library," he noted, gesturing toward the book she'd left on a side table. "Yes, you have an interesting collection." Elizabeth loved reading. I kept adding to it after he left the sentence unfinished. "Feel free to use anything there." After supper, instead of retreating to his study, Jackson surprised her by settling in the chair opposite hers, near the fire. From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "I thought you should have something to mark our arrangement, even before the official ceremony." Eleanor accepted the ring, unexpectedly touched by the gesture. "It's beautiful." "It's practical," he corrected, though something in his tone suggested he was pleased by her response. People respect a wedding band, makes things simpler. As she slipped the ring onto her finger, Eleanor realized this was perhaps the most honest beginning to a marriage she could have hoped for. No false promises or romantic delusions, just two people facing reality together. "I should warn you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm still the same woman who was too outspoken for Silver Creek. That won't change even here." For the first time, Eleanor saw what might have been the ghost of a smile touch the undamaged corner of his mouth. "Miss Reed, Eleanor, if I wanted a meek woman, I'd have sent for one. The double M doesn't need to be gentle. It needs to be fierce." The fire crackled between them, casting warm light on two faces marked in different ways by life's hardships. Outside, the vast Montana night wrapped around the ranch house, stars emerging one by one above the snow-covered valley. Despite the cold beyond the windows, Eleanor felt something unexpected begin to thaw within her. Not hope exactly, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. The hands of the grandfather clock in the hall marked the passage of minutes as they sat in silence, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. In that moment of wordless understanding, Eleanor Reed, soon to be Miller, knew she had finally found a place where her strength would be an asset rather than a liability. What neither could possibly know was how soon that strength would be tested, or how the coming spring would bring challenges that would require every measure of fierceness they both possessed. The weeks following Caroline's departure settled into a rhythm that suited Eleanor's methodical nature. Mornings began before dawn, with the preparation of breakfast for Jackson and the ranch hands. By the time the men trudged in from the bunkhouse, stamping snow from their boots and bringing with them the scent of cold air and horses, she had hot coffee, flapjacks, and salt pork waiting. December deepened, bringing shorter days and longer nights. The snowdrifts grew taller against the barn walls, and the paths between buildings required daily clearing. Eleanor adapted to ranch life with the same determination that had carried her through previous challenges, tackling each new task as a puzzle to be solved, rather than an obstacle to overcome. She discovered an unexpected ally in Walter Jenkins. The taciturn foreman began bringing her small offerings: a particularly fine piece of kindling for the kitchen stove, a rabbit he'd snared while checking fence lines, a wooden spoon he'd carved during evening hours. In return, Eleanor made sure his favorite cornbread appeared regularly on the supper table. "Walter says you've reorganized the pantry," Jackson remarked one evening as they sat before the fire. These quiet hours after supper had become a wordless ritual, each occupied with their own tasks, but sharing the companionable silence. Eleanor looked up from her mending. "I hope that's acceptable. Caroline's system was perfectly functional, but I found a way to group items that might save steps." Jackson nodded, returning to the ledger balanced on his knee. "Your house, your decision." The simple phrase carried weight beyond its brevity. Your house. Not Caroline's anymore. Not even just his. In 3 words, Jackson had acknowledged her place and authority within the household. As Christmas approached, Eleanor noticed the ranch hands growing restless. Many had families in distant towns, sweethearts waiting, or simply craved the rowdy entertainments that Silver Creek's salons offered after months of isolation. "Traditionally, we close down operations for 3 days at Christmas," Jackson explained when she inquired. "Those with somewhere to go get a small bonus for the holiday. Those who stay share Christmas dinner with us." "How many usually remain?" "Walter always stays. Sometimes Cooper and Daniels if the weather's too harsh for travel. Eleanor began planning, immediately, drawing on childhood memories of Philadelphia Christmases to create something special. She set aside flour and sugar from their precious stores, dried fruit that had been carefully hoarded, and even broached the subject of slaughtering one of the chickens kept in the coop behind the house. Jackson raised an eyebrow at her ambitious menu, but offered no objection. If anything, she detected a flicker of something like anticipation in his usually guarded expression. 2 days before Christmas, while checking the root cellar for potatoes, Eleanor discovered a small pine sapling that had been carefully placed. Behind the barrels, its presence was puzzling until Walter appeared at her elbow, looking uncharacteristically sheepish. "Thought the house could use something festive," he mumbled. "Mr. Miller's wife always put up a tree." Eleanor's throat tightened unexpectedly. "That's very thoughtful, Walter. Would you help me bring it inside?" Together, they set up the tree in the parlor's front window. Eleanor found a box of simple ornaments in the attic: wooden stars, pine cones dipped in wax, red ribbon carefully preserved from previous years. As she decorated, she felt Jackson's presence in the doorway behind her. "Elizabeth loved Christmas," he said, his voice holding none of its usual gruffness. "Spent weeks preparing little surprises for everyone." It was the first time he had voluntarily spoken of his late wife, and Eleanor recognized the significance. What was her favorite part of the celebration? Jackson moved into the room, reaching out to touch one of the wooden stars with his scarred hand. "The carols. She played the piano we had then, and everyone would gather to sing, even the hands who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." "The piano was lost in the fire?" He nodded, his expression distant. "Along with most everything else from that time, Christmas Eve dawned clear and bitterly cold." Eleanor rose early to begin preparations for the holiday feast, filling the house with the aromas of baking bread and roasting chicken. By midday, the table was set with Caroline's best linens and pine boughs decorating the mantel. When Jackson and the 3 remaining hands, Walter, Cooper, and young Daniels, gathered for the evening meal, Eleanor saw approval in their faces. The normally austere dining room had been transformed with candlelight and greenery. The food, while simple by Philadelphia standards, represented the best the ranch could offer in the depths of winter. "Mrs. Miller has outdone herself," Walter announced, using the title that still felt foreign to Eleanor's ears, though Jackson had introduced her as such to the hands after Caroline's departure. Their official marriage ceremony would wait until spring, when travel to town became possible again. "Indeed she has," Jackson agreed, his eyes meeting Eleanor's across the table with unexpected warmth. After the meal, they gathered in the parlor, where the little tree glowed with candles carefully clipped to its branches. Eleanor had wrapped small gifts for each man: knitted scarves for Cooper and Daniels, a new pipe for Walter, and for Jackson, a leather-bound journal she had discovered in Silver Creek and tucked away, for recording breeding lines and foaling. "Dates," she explained as he ran his fingers over the cover. "I noticed your current ledger is nearly full." In return, Walter presented her with a beautifully crafted wooden cutting board. Cooper and Daniels, looking embarrassed, offered a jar of honey they had traded for from a trapper passing through the previous week. Jackson disappeared briefly, returning with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It isn't much," he said, handing it to Eleanor. Inside was a silver hairbrush with matching hand mirror, their surfaces etched with a delicate pattern of flowers. "They were my mother's," Jackson explained. "Caroline thought you should have them." The unexpectedness of the gift rendered Eleanor momentarily speechless. These precious family heirlooms represented more than mere objects. They were an acknowledgement of her place within the household, within Jackson's life. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand the depth of gratitude behind the understated response. Later, after the hands had retired to the bunkhouse and the house had grown quiet, Eleanor and Jackson remained by the fire. The Usual silence between them felt different somehow, warmer, less a barrier than a shared comfort. This was the first Christmas since the fire that felt like a celebration, Jackson said finally, his gaze fixed on the flames. Elizabeth would have approved. The compliment, indirect though it was, warmed Eleanor more than the fire before them. She had dreaded Christmas as a potentially painful reminder of all Jackson had lost. Instead, it had become a tentative bridge between past and present. January brought blizzards that confined everyone to their respective quarters for days at a time. Eleanor used the enforced isolation to tackle long-neglected mending, take inventory of their supplies, and read her way through Jackson's library. To her surprise, he began joining her more frequently in the evenings, sometimes bringing ranch accounts to review, other times simply sitting with a book of his own. It was during one such evening that Eleanor first noticed Jackson massaging. His scarred left hand, his face tightening with pain, he clearly thought concealed. "The cold makes it worse," he acknowledged when she inquired. "The skin doesn't stretch properly over the joints." Eleanor remembered an ointment her father had used for his rheumatism. "May I try something that might help?" Jackson hesitated, then extended his damaged hand across the space between them, a gesture that required more courage than facing a charging bull, Eleanor suspected. The scarred tissue felt tight and unyielding beneath her fingers as she worked, the salve gently into his skin. Jackson remained utterly still, his breathing shallow. Eleanor realized this might be the first time since his injury that anyone had touched his scars deliberately, with care rather than clinical assessment or barely concealed revulsion. "The fire took more than skin," he said unexpectedly, his voice low. "Full use of these fingers, certain expressions. People see the outside damage and think that's the worst of it." Eleanor continued her careful ministrations, understanding he needed to speak without the weight of her gaze. "What was the worst of it? Trust." The word emerged rough-edged. "In myself, in the future, holding anything worth having." The admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Eleanor completed her task in silence, respecting the magnitude of what he had shared. "Thank you," he said simply, when she finished, flexing his fingers experimentally. "It does feel better." That night marked a subtle shift in their relationship. The careful distance Jackson had maintained began to dissolve, revealing glimpses of the man who existed beneath the scars and stoicism. February brought thaws and freezes in unpredictable cycles, making ranch work treacherous. The men returned, each evening exhausted, sometimes injured from falls on ice or kicks from nervous horses. Eleanor expanded her duties to include tending these injuries, applying poultices and bandages with the same efficiency she brought to household management. It was during one of these bitter cold spells that disaster struck. Jackson and Walter had ridden out at dawn to check on a group of pregnant mares isolated in a sheltered valley 2 miles from the main ranch. By midday, when they had not returned, young Daniels volunteered to look for them. He returned an hour later, his face white with cold and fear. "Avalanche in the North Valley," he gasped as Eleanor met him at the door. "Path to the mares is blocked. No sign of the boss or Walter." Eleanor's mind raced with calculations, how long the men had been exposed to the elements, how quickly hypothermia could set in, what resources they had for a rescue. "Get Cooper and the others," she instructed Daniels. "Bring ropes, shovels, and the medical supplies from the pantry cabinet. I'll prepare hot bricks and blankets." "Mrs. Miller," Daniels hesitated, "the route through Devil's Canyon is still open, but it's dangerous in these conditions. The men think we should wait for better weather before attempting. Mr. Miller and Walter could freeze to death while we wait." Eleanor cut him off. "We leave in 20 minutes. The young ranch hand blinked at her tone, but nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor changed into the warmest clothing she owned, Woolen trousers she had fashioned from an old blanket, layers of shirts and sweaters, thick socks, and the heavy boots Jackson had ordered for her from the Silver Creek Mercantile. Around her waist, she buckled a belt that held a hunting knife and small hatchet. When she emerged from the house, the ranch hands were gathered by the barn, preparing horses and supplies. Their expressions registered surprise at her attire, but no one voiced an objection as she issued clear, concise orders. "Cooper, you're the best tracker. You'll lead. Daniels and I will follow with the medical supplies. Peterson and Wilson bring up the rear with additional ropes and tools. We'll approach through Devil's Canyon single file, maintaining voice contact at all times." The men exchanged glances, unused to taking orders from a woman, but the urgency of the situation overrode any hesitation. Devil's Canyon earned its name honestly. A narrow passage between sheer rock faces, treacherous in the best conditions. Potentially lethal now, with ice glazing its surfaces and snow threatening to slide from overhanging ledges. Eleanor focused on guiding her horse carefully, ignoring the gnawing fear that threatened to overwhelm her practical nature. The journey that normally took 40 minutes stretched to nearly 2 hours of careful navigation. When they finally emerged from the canyon, the North Valley spread before them, or rather what remained of it. A massive wall of snow and debris had swept down the mountainside, obliterating the trail and part of the sheltered meadow where the mares had been kept. "Spread out," Eleanor called. "Look for any sign, tracks, disturbed snow, color that doesn't belong." The men fanned across the area, calling for Jackson and Walter. Eleanor scanned the terrain systematically, forcing herself to think like Jackson would in this situation. The mares had been kept in a natural enclosure formed by a stand of pines and a rock outcropping. If the men had reached them before the avalanche— "There!" she shouted, pointing toward a dark shape protruding from the snow near the tree line. "Cooper, bring the ropes!" As they approached, the shape resolved into the hindquarters of a horse, partially buried. The animal was dead, its body already growing stiff. Eleanor recognized Jackson's saddle blanket pattern with a sinking heart. "They must be nearby," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The men wouldn't have abandoned their mounts unless they were seeking shelter. The rock outcropping that formed one wall of the mare's enclosure rose about 12 feet high, with a slight overhang that might offer minimal protection. Eleanor circled it, scanning for any sign of human presence. A flash of color caught her. A scrap of fabric caught on a jagged edge of rock. Moving closer, she discovered a narrow crevice, barely visible unless one stood at exactly the right angle. "Here!" she called sharply. "There's an opening!" Cooper arrived at her side, peering. Into the darkness. "Could be a bear den, or it could be the only shelter available to men caught in an avalanche," Eleanor countered, already removing her gloves to better feel the edges of the opening. "Mr. Miller, Walter, can you hear me?" At first, only silence answered. Then, faintly, a sound emerged, not a voice, but a deliberate tapping. 3 sharp raps, followed by 3 more. "They're alive!" Eleanor's voice cracked with relief. "Quick, the ropes, we need to widen this opening." What followed was a grueling test of endurance as the rescue party carefully cleared snow and smaller rocks from the crevice entrance. The opening gradually widened enough for Eleanor, being the smallest among them, to squeeze through with a lantern. The space beyond was larger than the entrance suggested, a shallow cave extending about 15 feet into the rock face. Huddled at the back were Jackson and Walter, the older man unconscious and wrapped in both their coats. Jackson hunched protectively beside him. "Eleanor." Jackson's voice was hoarse with cold and disbelief. "How did you find us?" "Later," she replied, already assessing Walter's condition. "We need to get you both out of here before another slide comes down." Walter had suffered a broken leg and showed signs of hypothermia. Jackson had fared somewhat better physically, though his scarred hand was blue with cold. Moving them through the narrow opening required careful coordination and Eleanor's firm direction to the ranch hands. By the time they secured both men on horses for the journey home, darkness was falling, making the return through Devil's Canyon even more perilous. Eleanor rode beside Jackson, supporting him when he swayed with exhaustion. "The mares," he murmured at one point. "We were checking on them when we heard the slide start." "Daniels found them," Eleanor assured him. "They moved to higher ground instinctively, all safe, including the near-term ones." Jackson nodded, his eyes closing briefly. "You shouldn't have risked the canyon in these conditions." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Would you have done differently if our positions were reversed?" The question hung between them, finally answered with the barest hint of a smile on Jackson's wind-chapped lips. "No, but I would have expected no less from you." At that moment, as snowflakes began to fall around them and the difficult journey home still stretched ahead, Eleanor understood that something fundamental had changed. Jackson Miller had seen her not just as capable or fierce, but as his equal, someone who would risk everything for what mattered, just as he would. And in his eyes, Eleanor Reed, the mail-order bride rejected for being too fierce, had finally found what she had sought all along. Not just respect, but recognition of her true worth. The weeks following the avalanche rescue brought new dimensions to life at the Double M. Walter's recovery confined him to a bed in the main house, where Eleanor tended his broken leg and gradually nursed him back to health. Jackson, though physically less injured, fought a persistent cough that had developed after hours in the frigid cave. Lung fever, Eleanor diagnosed, recognizing the symptoms from her father's final illness. "You need rest and steam treatments." Jackson predictably resisted. "Spring foaling begins in 3 weeks. There's no time for coddling. And there's no time for burying the ranch owner either," Eleanor countered, meeting his stubborn glare with equal determination. "The men can manage the preparations. Cooper knows the breeding program almost as well as you do." Their battle of wills ended in compromise. Jackson would rest mornings and submit to treatments, then supervise afternoon work from the house porch, delegating tasks rather than performing them himself. This new arrangement inadvertently created opportunities for them to interact in ways they hadn't before. Eleanor included Jackson in household decisions previously handled solely by her. Jackson, for his part, began explaining ranch operations and breeding philosophies as they reviewed ledgers together at the kitchen table. "These bloodlines," Eleanor noted, tracing a finger along a complex chart of horse lineages, "you've developed them specifically for endurance and intelligence rather than pure speed." Jackson nodded, pleased by her observation. "Army scouts and serious ranchers need horses with sense, not just flash. A pretty stallion that spooks at shadows gets men killed in Indian territory." "You served with the cavalry during the war." It was the first direct reference either had made to his military past, though Eleanor had noticed the regimental photograph tucked in his desk drawer. 5th Cavalry, joined at 17, 2 years before the war ended. His expression grew distant. "Learned about horses from an old sergeant who'd been riding since the Mexican War. After my discharge, horses seemed a more honorable profession than most available to former soldiers." These quiet conversations revealed layers to Jackson Miller that his taciturn exterior concealed. A self-educated man with firm principles, unexpected knowledge of literature from long winter evenings with little entertainment, and a dry humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. In turn, Jackson discovered that behind Eleanor's practical efficiency lay a sharp intellect and surprising knowledge of business operations, gleaned from years assisting her accountant father. "You have a mind for systems," he remarked one evening, as they reviewed her reorganization of the ranch's supply tracking. "You see patterns others miss." Coming from Jackson, the simple observation carried more weight than flowery compliments from her previous suitors. Eleanor felt a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with romantic notions and everything to do with genuine appreciation of her abilities. By mid-March, the snow began its reluctant retreat from the valley. Patches of muddy ground emerged, growing larger each day. The creek that cut through Double M property swelled with snowmelt, its gentle summer burble transformed into a rushing torrent. With improving weather came the first foals of the season. Eleanor found herself drafted into stable duty when two mares went into labor simultaneously one cold morning. Under Jackson's calm direction, she helped deliver a spindly-legged colt, her sleeves rolled up and arms elbow-deep in the messy miracle of birth. "Good hands," Jackson commented afterward, as they watched the wobbly newborn nurse for the first time. "Steady. The mare trusted you." Eleanor wiped sweat from her brow, aware she must look a fright covered in straw and less mentionable substances, yet feeling an unexpected satisfaction. It was remarkable, creating your future stock right before your eyes. "Building something that lasts," Jackson agreed, his expression softening as he watched the mare nuzzle her foal. "That's what this place is about." As March yielded to April, the pace of ranch life accelerated. Fields needed preparation for spring planting. Cattle returned from winter grazing lands for counting and branding. The last foals arrived, completing the season's new crop of potential champions. Through it all, Eleanor and Jackson worked in increasingly seamless partnership. She took over the ranch accounts entirely, freeing him to focus on training and breeding decisions. When spring cleaning required moving heavy furniture, he appeared without being asked to help shift the massive oak armoire. They developed an unspoken language of nods and glances that communicated more efficiently than words. The planned trip to Silver Creek for their official marriage ceremony kept being postponed, first by Walter's recovery needs, then by foaling season, then by the creek flooding the main road. Neither seemed particularly concerned by the delay. "The hands already call you Mrs. Miller," Jackson pointed out when Eleanor mentioned the matter. "The paperwork is a formality." Yet beneath the practical exterior of their arrangement, subtle changes emerged. Jackson began bringing Eleanor wildflowers he found while checking fence lines. Eleanor took particular care with the coffee cake she knew he favored. Their evening conversations by the fire stretched longer, occasionally veering into personal territory neither had previously broached. "Did you leave someone behind in Philadelphia?" Jackson asked one such evening. "A suitor your father might have approved of before his passing?" Eleanor considered the question, surprised by his interest in her past. "There was a mathematics professor at the university who expressed interest. My father thought highly of him. But you didn't. He wanted a wife who would enhance his social standing while requiring little genuine interaction. When he described our potential life together, I was to manage his household and appear decoratively at faculty functions, but otherwise occupy myself with appropriate female pursuits that wouldn't disturb his work." Jackson's mouth quirked in what Eleanor had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "He clearly hadn't taken your measure." "Few men do," she replied simply, "until they find themselves unsettled by it." The unspoken question lingered between them. Had he taken her measure correctly? Did her fierce independence unsettle him as it had the others? But Jackson merely nodded as if confirming something to himself and turned the conversation to the next day's tasks. In late April, a letter arrived from Caroline, carried by a passing freight wagon. Along with news of her mother's improved health came a startling announcement. Caroline had reconnected with a childhood sweetheart and planned to marry in June. "She won't be returning to the Double M," Jackson said after reading the letter, his tone neutral, though Eleanor detected a hint of concern in his expression. "This changes matters." "How so?" Eleanor asked, setting aside the bread dough she'd been kneading. Our arrangement presumed Caroline's eventual return. With her settling permanently in Boston, the management of this household becomes a longer commitment than you agreed to. Eleanor wiped flour from her hands, considering his words. Are you suggesting our arrangement should end? I'm suggesting you deserve the opportunity to reconsider. Jackson met her gaze directly. You've proven yourself more than capable. With references from the Double M, you could secure a position in any household in the territory or return east with means for a fresh start. The offer was generous, even noble. It was also, Eleanor realized with a clarity that surprised her, entirely unwelcome. Do you want me to leave? She asked quietly. What I wish for is irrelevant. This was a practical arrangement between us. Then let me speak practically. Eleanor squared her shoulders. I have established systems here that function well. I've learned the rhythm of ranch operations and developed working relationships with the hands. Starting over elsewhere would be inefficient and unnecessary. She paused, then added, unless you find my presence here unsatisfactory. Jackson studied her face, searching for something in her expression. Your presence is far from unsatisfactory, Eleanor, but I won't hold you to terms that have fundamentally changed. The terms that matter to me haven't changed. I still require respect and meaningful work. You still require household management and assistance with the business aspects of the ranch. Her heart was beating faster than the simple exchange warranted. The timeline is a minor adjustment. Something eased in Jackson's posture. Then we continue as before. With one amendment, Eleanor added, it's time we formalized our arrangement. Improperly. The next supply run to Silver Creek, we should accompany it and visit Pastor Williams. Jackson nodded once, decisively. Agreed. The journey to Silver Creek 2 weeks later marked Eleanor's first return to the town since her departure. 5 months earlier, she found herself viewing the dusty main street with new eyes, no longer as a displaced Easterner desperately seeking acceptance, but as the capable partner of a respected rancher. Mrs. Miller, Mrs. Parker called, hurrying from the boarding house porch. What a wonderful surprise! The genuine warmth in the older woman's greeting touched Eleanor. They had corresponded briefly through infrequent mail deliveries, but seeing a familiar, friendly face was unexpectedly moving. You're looking well, Mrs. Parker continued, giving Eleanor an appraising glance. Ranch life clearly agrees with you. It's been educational, Eleanor replied with a smile, and Mr. Miller, Walter wrote that there was some trouble with an avalanche this winter. We managed, Eleanor said simply, not elaborating on her role in the rescue. Jackson and Walter have both recovered fully. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in his small church that afternoon, with Mrs. Parker and Walter serving as witnesses. The simple exchange of vows felt almost anticlimactic after the months of building partnership that had preceded it. Yet Eleanor found herself unexpectedly moved when Jackson slipped his mother's ring, which she had continued to wear since Christmas, onto her finger as an official wedding band. Not much different than before, Walter commented at the small celebration Mrs. Parker insisted on hosting afterward. You two have been acting married since December. Eleanor caught Jackson's eye across the room, noting the subtle quirk of his mouth that signaled amusement. Perhaps Walter was right. The certificate, now tucked in Jackson's coat pocket, merely formalized what daily life had already established between them. Their return to the Double M coincided with the arrival of a spring storm, not the dangerous blizzards of winter, but a warm, persistent rain that transformed the ranch into a sea of mud and new grass. The hands had secured the livestock and equipment before their departure, so there was little to do but unload their few purchases and settle in to wait out the downpour. That evening, as thunder rolled across the valley, Eleanor sat at the kitchen, table updating the household ledger with their recent expenditures. Jackson entered quietly, setting a small package beside her workbook. "What's this?" she asked, looking up in surprise. "Something I picked up in town while you were visiting with Mrs. Parker." Eleanor unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of intertwined oak leaves. Inside nestled a silver pen with a pearl inlay. "Handle, your current pen leaks," Jackson explained, suddenly appearing uncomfortable with the gesture. "I noticed the ink stains on your cuffs." Eleanor ran a finger over the delicate craftsmanship of both box and pen. This was not a practical gift like the hairbrush and mirror at Christmas, which had family significance. This was something Jackson had selected specifically for her, noticing a detail most would overlook. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Jackson nodded, his scarred hand flexing at his side, a gesture she had come to recognize as his response to emotional discomfort. "I should check the barn before turning in. The new foals get nervous in storms." Eleanor watched him don his rain slicker and disappear into the deluge, understanding his need for space. Their relationship had developed according to clearly defined parameters: practical, respectful, and purposefully devoid of romantic entanglements. The gift represented a small step beyond those boundaries, and Jackson Miller was not a man who stepped carelessly. Later that night, as lightning illuminated her bedroom in brief, brilliant flashes, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The day's events had stirred emotions she had carefully contained since arriving at the Double M. She had succeeded in creating a place for herself here, earning respect on her own terms rather than through conforming to others' expectations. The fierce independence that had rendered her unsuitable to 3 previous potential husbands had proven her greatest asset in this remote, demanding environment. Yet something remained unsettled within her. The practical arrangement with Jackson had evolved into genuine partnership, perhaps even friendship. But as she turned the silver pen between her fingers in the darkness, Eleanor acknowledged that her feelings had developed beyond the comfortable boundaries they had established. Tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, followed by shouts from outside. Eleanor moved to the window, peering through rain-streaked glass to see lanterns bobbing near the creek that bordered the ranch property. Without hesitation, she grabbed her robe and hurried downstairs. Jackson burst through the front door. As she reached the bottom step, his clothes soaked and mud-spattered. "Creek's overflowing its banks," he said tersely. "The south pasture where we moved the mares and foals is flooding. We need to get them to higher ground immediately." Eleanor was already moving toward the hook where her outdoor clothes hung. "I'll help. What do you need me to do?" Jackson paused, taking in her resolute expression and ready stance. In that moment, something shifted in his gaze, a final barrier falling away. "Ride with me," he said simply. "The foals trust you." Outside, the rain fell in sheets, turning the world into a chaotic blur of water and mud. The creek had indeed breached its banks, sending a surge of muddy water across the lower pasture land, where the most valuable breeding stock had been placed to enjoy spring grass. Several hands were already working to guide the frightened animals toward the sloping ground that led to the main barn area. Eleanor mounted the sturdy gelding Walter held ready, grateful for the months of riding experience she had accumulated. Since arriving at the Double M, Jackson swung onto Tempest, the black stallion that responded to his commands like an extension of himself. "Stay close," he instructed as they urged their horses toward the flooded pasture. The waters running, fast enough to sweep a horse off its feet in the lowest areas. What followed was a chaotic blur of driving rain, panicked horses, and desperate coordination. Eleanor focused on keeping a group of mares with young foals together, positioning her mount strategically to block their attempts to scatter. Jackson worked with Tempest to guide the entire herd toward the gate that would lead them to safety. The work required every ounce of concentration and riding skill Eleanor possessed. The frightened animals resisted direction, the foals struggled to keep pace in the deepening mud, and the roar of water and rain made verbal communication nearly impossible. Yet somehow, she and Jackson functioned as a seamless unit, anticipating each other's movements and compensating for the challenges the other faced. A flash of lightning revealed a mare and foal separated from the group, dangerously close to the rushing creek waters. Without hesitation, Eleanor guided her gelding toward them, calculating the safest approach through the flooded terrain. "Eleanor, wait!" Jackson's shout barely carried through the storm. But Eleanor had already committed to her course. She urged, her mount through water that reached above its knees, keeping a careful eye on the footing beneath. The mare watched her approach warily, positioning herself protectively before her foal. "Easy," Eleanor called, her voice gentling despite the storm's chaos. "Easy, girl. We're going to help you." Using techniques she had learned watching Jackson with fractious horses, Eleanor gradually earned the mare's guarded trust, eventually positioning herself to guide both animals toward higher ground. The foal stumbled once, nearly going under in a deeper section, but regained its footing with a desperate surge of gangly legs. By the time they reached the gate where Jackson waited, Eleanor was shivering with cold and exertion, but triumphant. The entire valuable breeding herd had been saved from the flash flood, with no injuries beyond minor scrapes and exhaustion. In the relative shelter of the barn's wide doorway, Jackson dismounted and reached up to help Eleanor from her saddle. His hands lingered at her waist as her feet touched the ground, steadying her when her legs trembled with fatigue. "That was either the bravest or most foolhardy thing I've seen," he said, his voice rough with emotion that belied the critical words. "You could have been swept away." Eleanor pushed wet hair from her face, too exhausted for pretense. "I couldn't let them drown. Not after watching that foal born, knowing how much work went into breeding that bloodline." "To hell with the bloodline." Jackson's hands tightened on her arms. "If anything had happened to you." The unfinished sentence hung between them, charged with meanings neither had allowed themselves to express. Eleanor met his gaze steadily despite the rain running down, her face and the violent trembling that had overtaken her body. "Nothing happened," she said softly. "We saved them together." Jackson's expression shifted, the careful control he maintained cracking to reveal something raw and powerful beneath. Without warning, he pulled her against him, one hand cradling the back of her head as his mouth found hers in a kiss that contained months of unspoken feelings. Respect transformed into admiration, partnership deepened into attachment, and something fiercer and more fundamental that neither had been willing to name. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find someone willing to fight as hard for this place as I do," he admitted, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Someone who sees its value beyond mere land and livestock." "A home worth defending," Eleanor murmured. "Understanding completely. Worth building together." Around them, the storm continued to rage, but within the shelter of the barn doorway, something new had weathered its first test and emerged stronger. A bond formed not from necessity or convenience, but from genuine recognition of equal spirits. The mail-order bride, too fierce for town life, had found not just acceptance, but appreciation in the scarred rancher who recognized the warrior in her heart. The morning after the flood brought clear skies and the daunting task of assessing damage. Eleanor woke early, her body aching from the previous night's exertions, but her mind surprisingly clear. The revelation of feelings between her and Jackson had shifted something fundamental, yet the practical demands of ranch life remained unchanged. She dressed and made her way to the kitchen, finding Jackson already at the table with maps of the property spread before him. He looked up when she entered, his expression softening in a way that made her heart quicken despite her exhaustion. "The creek receded to its banks," he reported. Walter and Cooper rode out at first light to check the south pasture fencing. Eleanor nodded, moving to the stove to prepare coffee. "And the animals?" "No losses among the breeding stock. 2 older geldings from the working string are missing. The hands are looking for them now." Their conversation maintained its usual efficiency, but beneath the practical exchange lay a new awareness. When Eleanor placed a coffee cup before him, Jackson's fingers brushed hers deliberately. When he explained his concerns about erosion, along the creek bed, he pulled her chair closer to his so she could better see the map. These small gestures spoke volumes between two people unaccustomed to expressing sentiment openly. They had acknowledged something profound during the storm, but neither seemed eager to define it with words that might constrain what was still evolving between them. The following days brought endless work. Fields that had been prepared for planting now required draining and reworking. Fences needed repair where floodwaters had damaged posts or washed away sections entirely. The road to Silver Creek was temporarily impassable where a culvert had collapsed. Through it all, Eleanor and Jackson worked in tandem, their existing partnership enhanced rather than complicated by their new understanding. If the ranch hands noticed the lingering glances or the way their hands sought each other in unguarded moments, they had the good sense not to comment. Only Walter, observing them across the supper table, allowed himself a knowing smile, quickly hidden behind his coffee cup. May arrived with a burst of wildflowers across the valley and the first visitors to the Double M since winter. 3 men on horseback appeared one afternoon, their mounts bearing the distinctive brand of the Circle T, a large cattle operation 2 valleys over. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when they rode up, Jackson striding from the barn to meet them. From her vantage point, she could see the stiffness in his posture as he greeted the riders. "Afternoon, Miller," the lead rider called, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and an air of authority. "Been a while." "Tucker," Jackson acknowledged with a curt nod. "What brings you to the Double M?" "Heard you got that black stallion of yours producing some fine foals. Thought it might be time to discuss business." Jackson's stance remained guarded. "Double M bloodlines aren't for sale, as I've told your foreman before." Tucker dismounted despite the cool reception, handing his reins to one of his companions. "Every man has his price, Miller, especially when winter floods damage his operation." His gaze traveled assessingly over the property, noting the repairs still in progress. Eleanor set aside her trowel and rose, brushing soil from her skirts as she approached the men. Jackson's eyes flickered to her, a silent warning in their depths. "Mr. Tucker, I presume." She extended her hand with the confidence she'd once used in her father's accounting office when dealing with difficult clients. "Eleanor Miller, my husband and I welcome you to the Double M." Tucker's eyebrows rose in surprise as he automatically took her offered hand. "Miller, you old devil, no one mentioned you'd remarried." "Recent development," Jackson replied tersely. "Well, congratulations are in order then." Tucker's shrewd gaze shifted between them, recalculating his approach. "Perhaps we could discuss business over coffee. The ride from Circle T works up a thirst." Eleanor recognized the tactical retreat. "Of course, please come inside while your men water the horses." In the kitchen, she served coffee and the last of a berry pie while listening to Tucker's carefully casual inquiries about the ranch's operations. Though he addressed most questions to Jackson, his eyes frequently returned to Eleanor with speculative interest. "Your wife seems quite knowledgeable about your breeding program, Miller," he observed after Eleanor corrected a detail about foaling. "Dates, Mrs. Miller manages the business records, Jackson replied, the slightest emphasis on her name marking his territory in the subtle way of frontiersmen. Tucker leaned back in his chair, a new respect in his expression. Unusual arrangement. Efficient arrangement, Eleanor countered smoothly. Mr. Miller's expertise is better applied to training than bookkeeping. Smart woman, Tucker nodded appreciatively. Rare quality in these parts. The conversation eventually circled back to Tucker's original purpose, acquiring breeding rights to Tempest for his own mare stock. Eleanor watched the negotiation unfold with growing fascination. Tucker was clearly a skilled businessman, alternating flattery with veiled threats about the economic challenges facing small operations like the Double M. Jackson remained unmoved. The Double M is doing just fine, Tucker. Our reputation for quality speaks for itself. Quality doesn't matter if you can't get your stock to market, Tucker countered. The new railroad spur is going in on Circle T land. Anyone wanting to ship horses east will be paying me for the privilege. Eleanor saw Jackson's jaw tighten, a tell she had learned indicated suppressed anger. Before he could respond, she interjected, smoothly, how fortunate for the Circle T, though I understand the territorial governor has expressed concerns about monopolistic practices affecting smaller ranchers. She smiled pleasantly, reaching for the coffee pot. More coffee, Mr. Tucker. Tucker blinked, visibly recalibrating. You seem well informed about territorial politics, Mrs. Miller. I find it's important to understand factors that might impact our business, Eleanor replied. Just last month in Silver Creek, Judge Wilson mentioned the legislature is considering regulations to ensure fair access to transportation infrastructure. It was a calculated bluff based on fragments of conversation she had overheard months ago at Samuel Cooper's dinner party, but Tucker's expression confirmed she had struck a nerve. Politics has no place in business, he grumbled. On that we agree, Jackson said, the tension in his posture easing slightly as he followed Eleanor's lead. Which is why the Double M prefers straightforward transactions. We sell our stock directly to buyers who appreciate quality. No middleman required. The meeting ended with Tucker departing empty-handed, but clearly reassessing the Double M's vulnerability. As the riders disappeared down the valley, Jackson turned to Eleanor with newfound appreciation in his gaze. That bit about the territorial governor was inspired, he said. Tucker's been trying to pressure smaller operations out of business for years. Eleanor shrugged slightly. Men like that believe they can intimidate anyone who seems vulnerable. I simply suggested we aren't as isolated as he assumed. Jackson's scarred hand touched her cheek in a rare public gesture of affection. You continue to surprise me, Eleanor Miller. The encounter with Tucker marked a turning point in how Eleanor viewed her place at the Double M. No longer was she merely managing a household or even partnering in daily operations. She had defended the ranch against external threats as fiercely as Jackson himself would have. This revelation accompanied another significant change. That night, after the house had grown quiet and the lamps were extinguished, Eleanor heard a soft knock at her bedroom door. Jackson stood in the hallway, uncertainty visible in his normally confident posture. I thought perhaps, he began, then faltered. Eleanor held out her hand, drawing him across the threshold that had separated them for months. Words seemed unnecessary, as they discovered a new dimension to their evolving relationship, a physical expression of the trust and admiration that had grown between them through shared challenges and mutual respect. Later, as moonlight spilled through the window and Jackson's breathing deepened into sleep beside her, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The mail-order bride rejected for being too fierce had found her place not by diminishing her strength to accommodate others' expectations, but by finding a partner who valued that very quality. The summer unfolded in a pattern of productive days and intimate nights Their business partnership now enriched by deeper connection. Eleanor expanded her involvement in ranch operations, learning to gentle the young colts and developing an eye for bloodlines that complemented Jackson's experience. Jackson, in turn, revealed more of himself, memories of his childhood in Kentucky. Before the war, stories of Elizabeth and their son that no longer carried unbearable pain in the telling. In late June, a letter arrived from Mrs. Parker with an unexpected invitation. A regional agricultural fair would be held in Billings in July, with competitions for livestock and horses that could significantly enhance a breeding operation's reputation. Several Silver Creek families planned to attend, and Mrs. Parker had secured rooms at a respectable hotel for those making the journey. "We should consider it," Eleanor suggested over dinner, watching Jackson's reaction carefully. "The exposure could bring new clients for the yearlings." Jackson frowned slightly. "It's a 3-day ride each way, a week away from the ranch at minimum. Walter can manage things here, and Tempest deserves to be seen beyond our valley." Jackson's expression remained troubled. "It's not the ranch I'm concerned about." He gestured vaguely toward his scarred face. "Townfolk are one thing. A gathering, and that size," Eleanor understood immediately. In the isolation of the Double M, Jackson's scars were simply part of him, as familiar to her now as his rare smile or the sound of his voice. But in public, they drew stares and whispers that he normally avoided by limiting his interactions. "If you truly don't wish to go, we won't," she said gently. "But I think you underestimate how impressive you are, scars and all. The man who built the Double M and developed its bloodlines commands respect, regardless of appearance." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Jackson confessed fears he had never previously articulated. "After the fire, when I finally healed enough to leave the house, children would cry at the sight of me. Women would cross the street rather than pass too close." Eleanor traced the ridged skin of his cheek with gentle fingers. "People fear what they don't understand. Your scars tell a story of courage, not something to be feared. You never seem to notice them," he mused. "Even that first day." "I noticed," Eleanor corrected. "But I saw a man who had survived, not one defined by his wounds." In the end, they decided to attend the fair. Preparations consumed the following weeks as they selected which horses to show. Tempest himself, naturally, along with 2 promising yearlings from his first crop of foals. Eleanor altered one of her Philadelphia dresses for the occasion and convinced Jackson to order a new coat from the Silver Creek Mercantile. The journey to Billings passed more pleasantly than anticipated. Traveling with just Walter as companion and wrangler for the extra horses, Eleanor and Jackson enjoyed rare leisure time together, camping beneath star-filled skies and discussing plans for the ranch's future with an openness that acknowledged their shared investment in its success. Billings proved larger and more developed than Eleanor had expected, with permanent buildings replacing the temporary structures of frontier settlements. The hotel Mrs. Parker had recommended was modest but clean, catering to respectable travelers conducting business in the growing town. Their arrival at the fairgrounds the next morning created an immediate stir. Tempest's commanding presence drew attention even among the impressive array of horseflesh gathered for the competition. Jackson, initially tense under the curious gazes, gradually relaxed as the focus remained primarily on his stallion rather than his scars. "Jackson Miller! Thought that was your black devil I spotted." A weathered man in cavalry uniform approached, hand extended. "Major Hollister, formerly 5th Cavalry. You wouldn't remember me, but I never forgot the recruit who could gentle the wildest mounts in the remount string." Jackson's posture changed subtly, military habits resurfacing as he shook the major's hand. "Sir, good to see you again." Hollister turned appreciative eyes toward Tempest. "You've done well for yourself, Miller. This animal's got the look of those Spanish horses you always admired. Andalusian bloodlines on his damn side." Jackson confirmed, a hint of pride entering his voice, combined with quarter-horse strength. Smart cross. Hollister nodded approvingly. The Army's always looking for quality remounts. If your stock proves consistent, we could discuss a standing contract. The conversation continued, drawing other breeders and potential buyers as word spread of the exceptional black stallion from the Double M. Eleanor watched with quiet satisfaction as Jackson's initial self-consciousness gave way to confident expertise when discussing his breeding program. The fair's first day concluded with Tempest earning a blue ribbon in his class, the judges praising his conformation and temperament. That evening, at a social gathering for participants, Eleanor found herself approached by Mrs. Parker, who embraced her warmly. "My dear, you're positively glowing," the older woman observed. "Ranch life clearly agrees with you. It's been challenging." "In ways I never anticipated," Eleanor admitted. "But yes, I've found my place there." Mrs. Parker's knowing smile suggested she understood more than Eleanor had said. "And what of your husband? I remember a man who barely spoke 2 words together when he came looking for a mail-order bride too fierce for town life." Eleanor glanced across the room to where Jackson stood conversing with several men, his usual reticence tempered by genuine engagement with the topic. "We've both adapted," she said simply. The second day of competition featured the yearlings, with one taking second place in his class. More significantly, Jackson received several serious inquiries about purchasing offspring from Tempest's bloodline, including a tentative agreement with Major Hollister regarding Army remounts. That night, as they prepared for bed in their hotel room, Jackson seemed preoccupied. Hollister's offer could transform the Double M, he said, removing his boots thoughtfully. Regular Army contracts would provide stability through lean years. "It's a testament to what you've built," Eleanor agreed, brushing out her hair before the small mirror. "Your vision for breeding intelligent, durable horses is exactly what they need." Jackson watched her in the mirror's reflection. "What we've built," he corrected quietly. "The Double M is as much yours now as mine. I want you to know that." Eleanor set down her brush, turning to face him. "Jackson?" he approached, taking her hands in his. "I've been thinking about Tucker's visit, about vulnerabilities and protections." His scarred hand tightened around hers. "If anything happened, to me, I want to be certain you'd be secure. I've asked Williams to draw up papers, making you a full legal partner in the ranch." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on Eleanor. In a time when married women had few property rights, Jackson was offering her a level of independence and security virtually unheard of. "Nothing is going to happen to you," she said firmly, though deeply touched by his concern. "Probably not." He agreed with the faintest smile, but a wise rancher plans for all contingencies. Their third and final day at the fair culminated in the awarding of the Grand Champion Ribbon, a prestigious recognition that could establish a breeding operation's reputation throughout the territory. Against impressive competition from larger ranches, including Tucker's Circle T, Tempest was selected as reserve champion, second only to an established stallion from a Wyoming operation. The achievement exceeded their expectations, validating Jackson's years of careful breeding decisions. Eleanor watched his face as the ribbon was presented, seeing not disappointment at missing first place, but genuine satisfaction at the recognition of his work. The celebration dinner that evening brought together competitors and buyers in a local hotel dining room. Eleanor found herself seated near the wives of several prominent ranchers, women who initially viewed her with curiosity bordering on suspicion. "Mrs. Miller, we understand you take an unusual interest in your husband's breeding program," one woman remarked, her tone suggesting this was hardly proper. Eleanor smiled pleasantly. "The Double M is our shared enterprise. My husband's expertise with horses complements my skill with business matters." How progressive, another commented, exchanging glances with her companions. How practical, Eleanor corrected gently. Frontier life demands adaptability, wouldn't you agree? Before the conversation could continue, a commotion erupted near the bar, where several men, including Tucker from the Circle T, had been drinking heavily. Tucker's voice rose above the general conversation, deliberately pitched to carry. Second, placed to a scarred man with a mail-order bride. What's this territory coming to? His contemptuous laugh drew uncomfortable silence from those nearby. Heard she was rejected by half of Silver Creek before Miller took her in. Too fierce, they said. Guess a man with half a face can't be choosy. Eleanor felt the words like a physical blow, not for herself, but for Jackson. She turned to find him already on his feet, his expression dangerously still as he moved toward Tucker. Without hesitation, Eleanor intercepted him, placing a restraining hand on his arm. "This isn't the battlefield for us," she murmured, pitching, her voice for his ears alone. "Remember what's at stake. The army contract, their reputation, everything they had built. All could be jeopardized by a public brawl, regardless of the provocation." For a tense moment, Jackson remained rigid, with barely controlled fury. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Together they turned toward Tucker, who watched their approach with drunken belligerence. "Mr. Tucker," Eleanor addressed him with perfect composure despite the room's hushed attention, "I believe congratulations are in order for your third-place finish. Quite respectable for a breeding program still establishing quality bloodlines." The barbed compliment hit its mark. Tucker's face flushed darker with anger and embarrassment. "Now you let your wife fight your battles, Miller?" "My wife," Jackson replied with deliberate emphasis, "understands that true victory isn't measured in ribbons, but in respect earned through integrity and hard work." He placed his arm around Eleanor's waist. "Something the Circle T might consider emulating." A ripple of appreciative murmurs spread through the onlookers. Major Hollister stepped forward, his military bearing commanding attention. "Well said, Miller. The Army values character in its suppliers as much as quality in its horses." He extended his hand to Jackson. "I look forward to finalizing our arrangement when the paperwork is prepared." Tucker, effectively dismissed and publicly chastised, retreated to the bar amid whispers and sidelong glances. Eleanor and Jackson accepted congratulations from others who seemed eager to distance themselves from Tucker's outburst by demonstrating their own approval of the double. M's success. Later, as they prepared to return to their hotel, Major Hollister approached once more. "Miller, Mrs. Miller," he acknowledged them both equally. "That was well handled. Tucker's been throwing his weight around these gatherings for years. About time someone showed him breeding fine horses takes more than money and intimidation." "We appreciate your support, Major," Eleanor replied. "Character matters, Mrs. Miller, in horses and in people." Hollister's gaze moved between them. "The double M seems to have an eye for both. I suspect we'll be hearing much more about your operation in the coming years." As they walked the short distance to their hotel, Jackson remained unusually quiet. Only when they reached their room did he finally speak. "You stopped me from making a serious mistake back there. Tucker was baiting me deliberately, hoping I'd react like a hothead and discredit myself." Eleanor removed her shawl, considering his words. "It wasn't just calculation, Jackson. I couldn't bear to see him use our story, my past rejections, your scars, as weapons against us. Those things brought us together. They're not shameful secrets to be exposed." Jackson crossed to her, taking her face gently between his scarred hand and his whole one. "No," he agreed softly. "They're the making of us." In that moment, standing in a hotel room far from the ranch that had become her true home, Eleanor Reed Miller felt the final pieces of her journey fall into place. The fierce independence that had once made her unsuitable as a wife had become her greatest strength. The man whose battle scars had isolated him from others had found in her not just acceptance, but a true partner in every sense. She had traveled west seeking security and found instead her own voice. He had sought practical assistance and discovered healing for wounds that went far deeper than skin. Together, they had forged something neither had imagined possible, a partnership of equals built on respect, shared purpose, and the recognition that sometimes the qualities others reject become the very foundation of strength. The journey back to the Double M carried a triumphant air. Tempest pranced with characteristic pride, seemingly aware of the silver medallion now attached to his bridle. The yearlings followed docilely, having matured during their adventure beyond the valley. As they created the final ridge overlooking the ranch, Eleanor remained in her mount beside Jackson's. From this vantage point, the Double M spread before them. The sturdy main house, the well-maintained barn and corrals, fields green with summer growth. What had once seemed so foreign to her eastern eyes now represented home in every sense of the word. "It looks different somehow," she mused aloud. Jackson nodded, understanding her meaning without need for elaboration. Seeing something from a distance changes your perspective. They had both returned altered by their expedition to Billings. Jackson carried himself with renewed confidence, the reserve champion ribbon and army contract tangible validation of his vision. Eleanor had discovered the satisfaction of defending their partnership in public, standing proudly beside the man whose scarred face no longer drew her notice, except as a badge of his courage. Their arrival sparked celebration among the hands who had maintained operations in their absence. Walter had organized a special supper to welcome them home, complete with a berry cobbler prepared by Cooper's wife, who had come from town for the occasion. "To the Double M," Walter proposed, raising his coffee cup in a toast. "Finest horseflesh in the territory, now official." The validation from Billings rippled outward in the weeks that followed. Word spread throughout the surrounding valleys of Tempest's recognition and the Miller breeding program's rising reputation. Inquiries about yearlings and breeding arrangements arrived by post, and occasional visitors who made the journey specifically to see the stallion. "We'll need to expand the south pasture," Jackson observed one evening as they reviewed the breeding schedule for the following spring, "and consider hiring another full-time hand specifically for training." Eleanor nodded, making notes in her precise handwriting with the silver pen that rarely left her desk. "The Army contract alone will require at least 15 suitable mounts annually. If we accept these civilian commissions as well, our production needs to increase by nearly a third." Their discussion continued past midnight, the practical challenges of expansion balanced against their commitment to maintaining quality. Eleanor suggested systematic improvements to their record-keeping to track bloodlines more effectively. Jackson considered which mares might be worth acquiring to diversify their stock. In such moments, the true strength of their partnership revealed itself. Two minds approaching problems from complementary perspectives, neither dominating nor yielding but building solutions together. August brought Caroline's promised visit following her June wedding. The stagecoach delivered her accompanied by her new husband, David Fletcher, a professor of mathematics at Harvard, whose scholarly appearance belied a surprisingly practical nature. Jackson. Caroline embraced her brother warmly, then turned to Eleanor with equal affection. "And my new sister." Walter's letters hardly did justice to the changes here. The two women had corresponded regularly, but meeting in person after nearly a year allowed Caroline to witness firsthand how completely Eleanor had integrated into ranch life. The house still bore Caroline's touches, curtains she had sewn, arrangements she had designed, but Eleanor's influence was evident in the expanded library, the efficient organization of the kitchen, and the addition of a small piano parlor purchased after their return from Billings. Music was Elizabeth's joy, Eleanor explained when Caroline commented on the instrument. Jackson mentioned it often enough that I thought the house should have music again. Caroline's gaze moved to her brother, noting how the mention of his first wife no longer caused him to withdraw into painful memory. "You've worked miracles here," she murmured to Eleanor when the men stepped outside to inspect a new foal. "Not just with the ranch, but with him." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "Not miracles, just patience and purpose. We found those in each other." During their 2-week stay, David revealed himself an unexpected ally in Eleanor's ongoing efforts to modernize the ranch's business operations. His mathematical expertise proved valuable in developing more sophisticated breeding projection models, and his university connections offered potential Eastern markets for their expanding stock. "Academic institutions and wealthy alumni are always seeking quality mounts," he explained over dinner. "Many have more money than knowledge when it comes to horseflesh. A reputable supplier with guaranteed quality would be most welcome." The visit concluded with promises of regular correspondence and potential business arrangements. As the stagecoach departed, Jackson watched it disappear down the valley with a contemplative expression. "Caroline seems truly happy," he observed. "I wasn't certain she would be, abandoning the West for Boston society." "She found her place, just as I found mine," Eleanor replied. "Different landscapes, but the same principle. Someone who values her for exactly who she is." The approaching autumn brought with it the first fruits of their Billings success. Major Hollister arrived with 2 junior officers to assess the yearlings and finalize the Army contract. The formality of the occasion was tempered by Hollister's evident respect for Jackson and his straightforward manner with Eleanor. "Mrs. Miller, these accounting provisions reflect your influence, I suspect," he noted, reviewing the detailed terms she had drafted. "Most ranch contracts lack this level of precision." "The Double M believes in clarity, Major," she replied. "It prevents misunderstandings later." After the officers departed, Jackson found Eleanor in the garden harvesting the last vegetables before frost. Without preamble, he handed her an envelope bearing the territorial government's seal. "This arrived with Hollister," he explained. "Apparently our friend Tucker has been making trouble beyond merely trying to acquire our bloodlines." The letter inside confirmed what Eleanor had suspected since their confrontation in Billings. Tucker had lodged a formal complaint about water rights along the creek that bordered both properties, claiming the Double M's usage during drought periods threatened his operation downstream. "He's retaliating for being publicly embarrassed," Eleanor observed, folding the letter precisely, "using legal channels instead of direct confrontation." Jackson nodded grimly. "A hearing is scheduled in Billings next month. We'll need to prepare documentation of our water usage and historical access rights." The challenge would have seemed overwhelming months earlier. Now, Eleanor viewed it as merely another problem to solve together. That evening, they spread maps and water records across the dining table, reconstructing the history of the Double M's development and its responsible stewardship of natural resources. "My father would have appreciated this," Eleanor remarked as she organized their evidence into a compelling narrative. "He always said thorough documentation was the best defense against opportunists." Jackson watched her work with quiet admiration. "When I placed that advertisement for a mail-order bride, I never imagined finding a legal strategist as well as a wife." The water rights hearing in October proved less daunting than anticipated. The territorial judge, impressed by the Double M's meticulous records and Eleanor's articulate presentation, dismissed Tucker's claims as opportunistic and unsupported by evidence. The ruling established clear guidelines for water usage that actually strengthened the Double M's position while imposing monitoring requirements on the Circle T. Their victory over Tucker marked the final challenge of a transformative year. As November brought the first snowfall to the valley, Eleanor and Jackson stood on the porch, watching white flakes dust the corrals, where Tempest and his mares huddled together against the cold. A year ago, I was packing my trunk at Mrs. Parker's boarding house, Eleanor reflected, wondering if the scarred, reclusive rancher who'd offered for me would find me as unsuitable as the others had. Jackson's arm settled around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. And I was wondering if the mail-order bride too fierce, for town life would flee at the first sight of my face or the isolation of this place. We were both afraid of rejection, Eleanor realized. Each is damaged in different ways by others' expectations. Each stronger than we knew, Jackson amended, turning her to face him as snowflakes caught in her hair and lashes. His scarred hand cupped her cheek with a tenderness few would have believed possible from the stoic rancher. You were never too fierce, Eleanor. The others were simply too weak to recognize what fierceness truly means. Courage, conviction, loyalty, everything is worth having. In that moment, as snow fell softly around them and the life they had built together stretched out in all directions, Eleanor Reed Miller understood the final irony of her journey. The very quality that had rendered her unsuitable as a proper wife had made her indispensable as a true partner. The man whose physical scars had isolated him from society had seen beyond appearances to recognize the warrior heart that matched his own. They had found in each other not completion, but amplification, each becoming more fully themselves through the other's recognition and respect. As they turned to enter the warmth of their home, leaving matching footprints in the fresh snow, the mail-order bride rejected for being too fierce, and the battle-scarred rancher who had valued that very quality walked together into a future they would continue to forge with the same strength, determination, and fierce hearts that had brought them together. Spring in Montana Territory, 1890. The Double M Ranch stood transformed from the isolated homestead Eleanor had first encountered 5 years earlier. Additional barns flanked the original structure, housing the expanded breeding stock that had made the Miller name synonymous with quality horseflesh throughout the Western Territories. Fenced pastures stretched across the valley, while a new wing extended from the main house, adding much-needed space for the growing operation. Eleanor sat at her desk in the office they had built 2 summers ago, reviewing correspondence from potential buyers as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. The reputation of Double M quarter horses had spread beyond military contracts and local ranches, attracting wealthy sportsmen and racing enthusiasts eager to incorporate their bloodlines. Movement in the doorway drew her attention. Jackson leaned against the frame, his tall figure silhouetted by morning light. 5 years had added silver threads to his dark hair, particularly at the temples, lending him a distinguished appearance that complemented the confidence he now carried effortlessly. The Lexington buyer arrived early, he informed her. Walters, showing him Tempest's new colt while I came to fetch you. Eleanor nodded, gathering the papers she had prepared for this meeting, lineage documentation, training records, and the health certification from the veterinarian who now visited quarterly. Mr. Harrington has traveled a considerable distance. We shouldn't keep him waiting. Together they walked toward the main stables, their strides naturally matching after years of moving through life as partners. Spring wildflowers dotted the pathway, and the mountains still bore snow on their peaks despite the valley's warmth. I received a letter from Caroline this morning, Eleanor mentioned. David's mathematics text has been accepted for publication by the University Press, and she's expecting their second child in November, Jackson smiled, the expression now coming naturally to his scarred face. Good news? Though I still find it hard to picture my sister as a professor's wife in Boston. No harder than she finds. It picturing you as the patriarch of a renowned horse-breeding empire, Eleanor countered with gentle humor. Our paths take unexpected turns. The expanded stable complex bustled with activity. 6 hands now worked full-time with the horses, while additional seasonal workers managed the hayfields and other ranch operations. Walter, promoted to breeding, manager after the First Army contract, stood in the center corral with a distinguished gentleman in Eastern attire. Between them pranced a magnificent yearling colt, coal-black like his sire Tempest, but with distinctive white socks on his front legs, the hallmark of a new bloodline Eleanor had persuaded Jackson to introduce 3 years earlier. "Mr. Harrington," Jackson called as they approached. "Welcome to the Double M. I see Walter's introduced you to Midnight Commander." The visitor turned, extending his hand with the enthusiasm of a true horse enthusiast. "Miller, this colt exceeds the descriptions in your correspondence. Magnificent bone structure and that chest depth. He'll have exceptional lung capacity. At maturity, my wife's eye for complementary bloodlines," Jackson acknowledged, drawing Eleanor forward. "Mrs. Miller manages our breeding selections personally." Harrington showed no surprise at a woman's involvement in such matters, a testament to how the Double M's reputation had normalized Eleanor's role. "A pleasure, Mrs. Miller. Your instincts regarding the Hancock mare crossing were clearly sound. I'm seeing strength combined with elegance that's rare in quarter-horse lines." The business discussion that followed moved from the corral to the house, where Eleanor had prepared refreshments. As they settled in the comfortable parlor, Harrington revealed the true purpose behind his journey from Kentucky. "I represent a consortium of breeders developing a formal stud book for American quarter horses," he explained. "Standardizing the breed is essential for its recognition and development. The Double M's meticulous records and proven bloodlines make you ideal founding members." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Jackson, recognizing the significance of this invitation. Formal breed recognition would solidify everything they had built, ensuring the Double M's place in equestrian history. "The timing is fortuitous," she replied. "I've been corresponding with several established breeders about standardizing terminology and registration practices. A formal association would benefit everyone committed to the breed's development." As they discussed details of the proposed registry, a commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Eleanor moved to the window, immediately identifying the cause. A young girl of about 4 years astride a gentle pony, her delighted squeals carrying clearly as Walter led her in careful circles around the yard. "My apologies," Jackson said, to their guest, though his proud smile belied any true regret. "Our daughter Margaret has recently discovered her riding legs and demands daily lessons." Harrington rose to observe the scene. "Starting them young, I see. A future horsewoman in the making." "Certainly not for lack of trying to interest her in more traditional pursuits," Eleanor said with a fond shake of her head. "She's as stubborn as her father and as impatient with indoor confinement as Tempest himself." The little girl spotted them at the window and waved enthusiastically, nearly unbalancing herself in the process. Her dark hair had escaped its braids, and her dress showed evidence of earlier barnyard explorations. But her face, unmarked by any tragedy, combined Eleanor's determined chin with Jackson's storm-grey eyes. After concluding arrangements with Harrington, who departed with a signed agreement and promises of continued collaboration, Eleanor found Jackson still watching their daughter from the porch. Margaret had graduated from riding to helping one of the hands collect eggs from the chicken coop, a task she approached with solemn concentration. "She's fearless," Jackson observed softly. "Takes after her mother that way." Eleanor leaned against the porch railing beside him, with occasional flashes of her father's temper when thwarted. The birth of Margaret Elizabeth Miller 3 years earlier had added an unexpected dimension to their partnership. Neither had discussed children during their pragmatic courtship, both assuming Jackson's grief for his lost son would preclude expanding their family. Yet after Eleanor's difficult pregnancy and Margaret's dramatic arrival during a thunderstorm with only Jackson and Mrs. Parker in attendance, the fierce protectiveness that bloomed in Jackson had surprised them both. Received word from Judge Wilson yesterday, Jackson mentioned, changing subjects. Tucker's selling the Circle T, moving to California for his health, apparently. The news marked the end of an era. Their periodic skirmishes with Tucker had diminished after the water rights ruling, but the neighboring rancher had remained a persistent, if increasingly ineffective, antagonist. "Who's purchasing the property?" Eleanor asked, calculating the potential impact on Double M operations. "Railroad Consortium. They're planning a major depot and stockyards at the north end of the property, with scheduled shipping directly to Chicago markets." Eleanor immediately recognized the opportunity. Direct rail access would reduce our shipping costs significantly. We should consider purchasing adjoining parcels before land values increase with development. Jackson nodded, having anticipated her response. "Already inquired about the section bordering our east pasture. Walter's riding to the land office tomorrow with our offer." Their seamless transition from family matters to business strategy exemplified the partnership they had forged, each anticipating the other's thoughts, both focused on building something lasting beyond themselves. That evening, after Margaret had been bathed, read to, and finally succumbed to sleep clutching the carved wooden horse Jackson had made for her last Christmas, Eleanor sorted through correspondence at the kitchen table. Among the business letters sat a personal note from Mrs. Parker, who had become a dear friend and Margaret's honorary grandmother. "Interesting news from Silver Creek," Eleanor remarked, scanning the letter's contents. "Henry Dawson has married again, a widow from Denver who's apparently transformed his mercantile into a thriving emporium." Jackson looked up from the breeding records he was reviewing. "Your first rejected suitor, the one who found you too informed about business matters." "The very same. According to Mrs. Parker, his new wife has implemented exactly the inventory system I suggested 5 years ago. He's now proudly telling everyone it was his innovation." Jackson's laugh held genuine amusement rather than derision. "And what of the banker? Cooper, wasn't it?" "Samuel remains unmarried, though apparently Mrs. Parker has a niece visiting this summer she thinks might suit him." Eleanor set the letter aside, reflecting on the strange, circular nature of life's journeys. It seems so long ago now, being rejected for qualities they couldn't appreciate. "Their loss," Jackson said simply. "Our gain." Later that night, after the lamps were extinguished and the ranch had settled into peaceful darkness, Eleanor stood at their bedroom window, gazing at the silhouette of mountains against the starlit sky. Jackson's arms circled her waist from behind, his chin resting atop her head in a familiar gesture. "I was thinking about that first winter," she said softly. "How uncertain everything seemed. How carefully we navigated around each other. I was terrified," Jackson admitted, his voice low near her ear. "Not of you, but of failing you, of not being whole enough to be what you deserved." Eleanor turned in his embrace, her hand automatically finding the scarred side of his face in the darkness. "And I feared my strength would eventually drive you away as it had the others, that you'd grow to resent what you once claimed to value." "Never." The single word carried absolute conviction. A cry from the adjoining room interrupted the moment, Margaret calling out from some childish nightmare. Without discussion, they both moved toward the door, another aspect of their partnership now instinctive between them. As Jackson lifted their daughter from her small bed, murmuring reassurances in his deep voice, Eleanor watched the tableau with a fullness in her heart that sometimes still caught her by surprise. The mail-order bride, too fierce for town life, had found not just acceptance, but celebration of her strength. The battle-scarred rancher had discovered healing through loving again, rather than retreating from life's possibilities. Morning would bring new challenges, horses to train, contracts to negotiate, a daughter to raise with the confidence to forge her own path. But as Margaret settled back to sleep between them, secure in the absolute certainty of their presence, Eleanor recognized the true legacy of their unlikely beginning. They had built the Double M's reputation on breeding horses that combined intelligence with endurance, strength with adaptability. Yet their greatest achievement lay not in bloodlines documented in stud books or contracts with prestigious buyers, but in creating a family and home where fierceness was valued as courage, where scars spoke of survival rather than defeat, and where two people who had been rejected for their differences had found in each other exactly what they needed to thrive. 2 months later, as summer heat shimmered across the valley, a letter arrived bearing the territorial governor's seal. Eleanor opened it at her desk, scanning the formal language with increasing surprise. "Jackson," she called, finding him in the stable supervising the training of a promising 3-year-old. "You should see this." He took the letter, eyebrows rising as he read its contents. "The Territorial Agricultural Board, they want both of us." Apparently our work with the Quarter Horse Registry has drawn attention in official circles. They're forming a commission to establish breeding standards for government purchases, and they want representatives with practical experience. Jackson handed the letter back, his expression thoughtful. "It would mean regular trips to Helena for meetings, time away from the ranch. Walter can manage operations during our absences," Eleanor pointed out, "and this position could influence agricultural policy throughout the territory. Imagine the possibilities for smaller ranchers if fair standards were established." His slow smile told her he'd already reached the same conclusion. "When do they need our answer?" That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Margaret chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, they drafted their acceptance letter together. The appointment would add new dimensions to their already full lives, but the opportunity to shape territorial policy aligned perfectly with the principles that had guided the Double M's development. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you wrote to Mrs. Parker seeking a bride rejected for being too fierce?" Eleanor asked, signing her name beside Jackson's on the formal response. "I hoped for competent household management and possibly civil conversation," he admitted with the dry humor that had emerged as his confidence grew. "I received a business partner, political advisor, mother to my child, and the other half of my soul. The territorial board seems a small matter by comparison." Eleanor sealed the envelope, her fingers lingering over the impression of the double, embrand pressed into the wax. From a practical arrangement born of necessity, they had forged something extraordinary, a partnership that had transformed not just themselves, but had begun to influence the very territory around them. As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared above the mountains that had witnessed their journey, the mail-order bride too fierce for Silver Creek and the battle-scarred rancher who had recognized the warrior in her heart sat together in contented silence, secure in the knowledge that their greatest strengths had never been in spite of their differences, but because of them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.